The minus 41 times.
What happens when one of the most stable countries on Earth prepares for collapse?
Switzerland, a nation synonymous with neutrality, precision, and financial resilience, has quietly developed triage plans for scenarios once thought unthinkable: total system breakdown, power grid failure, supply chain collapse, communication blackout, institutional paralysis.
These contingency frameworks, presented and analyzed by Verein WIR, raise urgent questions.
Who receives protection when resources run out?
How is medical care prioritized when infrastructure fails?
What does resilience really mean in a worst-case scenario?
At the minus 41 times, we investigate the documents, the policies, and the assumptions behind Switzerland's crisis architecture. Not to provoke fear, but to understand preparedness. Not to speculate, but to examine evidence.
Because when stability is treated as permanent, transparency becomes optional.
And when contingency plans exist, citizens deserve to know.
This is not alarmism.
This is analysis. Welcome to the minus 41 times.
Presented by Verein WIR. Today, we are talking about the systemic collapse of the West. So, quite a massive statement right at the start. In this podcast, we analyze the thesis that the Western world is facing an actual systemic collapse.
Right. And the surprising thing about it is the trigger. It is primarily not about geopolitical or purely economic factors, but about the rapid decline in the population's health.
Let's clarify right at the beginning where these enormously far-reaching statements actually come from.
The analysis is based on the statements of Florian Homm. He is an analyst and investor with, 50 years of professional experience in the financial markets.
He describes the year as the toughest prediction of his entire career.
Exactly. He considers this health decline to be more consequential than the conflicts in Ukraine or Gaza, and even more critical than inflation or artificial intelligence.
So let's jump directly into the demographic and health core data. We'll start with Germany.
The number of people in need of care has explosively reached the 6 million mark there.
When you look at the projections from the year 2020, this milestone was actually expected only in 25 years.
Exactly. And this number was reached in less than 5 years. The source explicitly emphasizes that this does not only affect seniors, but spans all age groups.
This brings us to the USA, where the picture is similarly drastic. Since 2020, there have been 5 million new severely disabled people.
In statistics, this is described as a 3.8 sigma event.
What does that mean?
It describes an extreme deviation from the norm. The probability of occurrence is comparable to the likelihood of a lightning strike. It is an absolute anomaly.
And in the workplace, these structural disruptions are also evident. The disability rate among the employed has increased by 38%.
Correct. Sick days have skyrocketed by 142% since 2020.
A quick look at Great Britain shows a similar picture. The number of people relying on health authority benefits has doubled between 2019 and 2025.
If we take this health data, we inevitably come to the economic and financial dimension. An average person in need of care costs around 14,000 euros per year.
With 6 million affected in Germany, the expenditures jump from 83 billion to an estimated 120 billion euros.
At least. And that is just the direct effort. The economic damage from the sick days is additionally estimated at 100 to 150 billion euros.
There are also enormous secondary effects.
Yes, 2 to 3 million family members are additionally occupied with caring for relatives and are absent from the regular labor market.
What does this mean for the state budget? The additional costs of at least 130 billion euros are offset by tax revenues of about 1 trillion.
According to the analysis, this inevitably leads to significantly higher taxes, massive national debt, and ultimately the looming collapse of fiat currencies.
The source here sharply criticizes the distribution of resources.
Absolutely. It is criticized that countries like Germany and the UK are saving their healthcare systems to the point of breaking, while at the same time investing 240 billion in military readiness and infrastructure.
That brings us to the specific anomalies in the labor market.
Let's look at the US labor market in January 2026. There, 130,000 new jobs were created.
Sounds like growth, but 9% of these jobs were created in the care and health system.
A purely defensive growth then. Exactly. The system must cushion the health decline of the population. The source states that about 32.8% of the population, almost every third key worker, is limited in their activities.
To justify this, the analysis provides medical claims, which we report here purely factually.
Correct. These limitations are attributed to a so-called spike protein penetration of 83%.
Additionally, the source mentions turbo cancer in all age groups and disproportionately growing mental disorders.
Under the motto, follow the money, the analysis then categorizes the market developments, and there are very
Especially
clear
in the
winners
pharmaceutical
here.
industry?
Yes. A selected basket of pharmaceutical stocks, which focus solely on the treatment of symptoms, has achieved a return of 62% in 14 months.
While the broad S&P 500 only rose 15% in each period, so capital is massively flowing into symptomatic treatments.
On the losing side are the insurers. The stock price of the world's largest health insurer, United Healthcare, fell 50% in 1 year.
Because significantly more services had to be provided, right?
Exactly. Treatments for myocarditis and pericarditis are explicitly mentioned among others.
This naturally also affects the citizens. In the United States, health insurance premiums increased by 20% from 2025 to 2026.
This enormous increase takes away citizens' discretionary income. That kills consumption.
And according to the source, it poses the immediate risk of a real estate crisis because loans can no longer be serviced.
Let's move on to the systemic classification. The source is not talking about coincidence here, but about deliberate deception and obfuscation.
Reference is made to the KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov, who outlined concepts for the systematic destabilization of a society.
The lockdowns and the influence of NGOs like the WHO are interpreted as part of an orchestrated plan.
The so-called Great Reset.
Concrete investment strategies are derived from this. According to the source, a classic long-only investment will fail, as only 10 to 15% of companies will survive this crisis.
We have huge text excerpts, internal documents, and also blog posts from the website of the Swiss association WIR. And we are talking about a spectrum that ranges from very profound, philosophical, fundamental questions about the nature of personal freedom to that. And this is the madness, extremely detailed, almost military-like emergency plans.
The texts involve sharp criticism of the UN Agenda 2030, massive skepticism towards the COVID-19 review, tangible fears of 5G technology, and explicit warnings about a so-called New World Order.
Yes.
We want to decipher what worldview and specific strategic measures are conveyed in this material. And that is highly fascinating.
Total, the core question that will guide us through this entire analysis is essentially, how does a group that obviously harbors massive, profound distrust towards state and global institutions specifically prepare for the absolute worst-case scenario? Yes. Okay, let's break this down. Where do we start?
To understand the actions and some of the truly extreme preparation plans of this association, we must first look at what they are so intensely trying to protect themselves from. We need to examine the foundation of their worldview before we get to all the checklists.
Let's start with the philosophical framework. What immediately struck me when reading the sources is that it's not just about stacking a few cans of ravioli in the basement for safety.
No, not
The
at
whole
all.
thing has a massive ideological core. Even the name WIRE is an acronym. It stands for the guiding values of effectiveness, intuition, and respect.
Interesting combination.
Absolutely. The texts then speak of overcoming evil with good, and there are calls for an enlightenment initiative under the term Eidgenossenschaft.
So, deliberately written with a hyphen?
Exactly, oath-community. That sounds like a strong return to historical, original roots.
This spelling and choice of words is a classic indicator of the longing for a pure, uncorrupted form of community. It is contrasted with a modern world perceived as thoroughly corrupt and hostile.
This modernity, perceived as hostile, is broken down in great detail on the website in a list of focus topics. It reads like a veritable map of their fears.
What does it all say?
On the one hand, there is health and the relentless demand for a comprehensive review of the coronavirus. Then, the technology of 5G mobile networks is explicitly described as both a blessing and a curse, with the curse in the context of radiation and surveillance clearly predominating.
The fear of surveillance is very present there.
It goes much further into global politics. The UN Agenda 2030 is heavily discussed, and governments are generally accused of governing past the people.
That is a strong accusation.
Absolutely. There is even a transcript in the material of a conversation between the club president Christian Oesch and Piero Sandiego, in which the New World Order is openly discussed.
Yes, the New World Order.
And then there are tangible environmental phenomena. They existed before geoengineering, that is, targeted weather manipulation, and in this context they report on mysterious spider webs in nature.
What is truly fascinating here is the psychological pattern that connects all these seemingly completely different topics. Think
How do you mean
about
that?
what 5G radiation, global UN agents, weather manipulation, and invisible pathogens have in common.
Are they all invisible?
Exactly. For these people, they all represent an ultimate, complete loss of control. It is the deep fear of the individual of invisible, overpowering, and incomprehensible structures.
Okay.
You cannot see 5G waves. You cannot physically grasp a global financial system. And you certainly cannot control the weather. These focus topics channel the oppressive feeling that one's own life is being controlled by external forces which are mostly perceived as malevolent.
And this perceived threat situation does not remain in the past. It is constantly adjusted to current events. We have very recent blog entries here, dated February 17th and 18th, 2026.
Really, from yesterday and the day before yesterday.
Exactly. It's no longer just about COVID. They discuss highly complex global structures like CPI 3.0 and contrast it with the Swiss laboratory in Spiez. How does that fit into this picture of loss of control?
When you mention Spiez, the National High Security Laboratory of Switzerland for nuclear, biological, and chemical threats, it immediately triggers a very specific image. Spiez, in their perception, still represents a national, somewhat tangible form of security and control.
Because it is in Switzerland.
Correct. In contrast, they position the global institutions in Geneva like the World Health Organization, which according to their current texts relies solely on self-declarations, thus acting non-transparently.
Okay, and CPI 3.0?
CPI 3.0 plays exactly into this fear. It is a global initiative whose declared goal is to set up vaccine infrastructures for new pathogens within just 100 days.
But to the average citizen, that actually sounds like a desirable positive medical advancement?
One might think so. However, from the association's perspective, the question of sovereignty is immediately raised. They ask, if a global organization pushes through vaccine development and distribution in just 100 days, who then bears the health and financial risk? Which national laws and review procedures are being bypassed in the name of the emergency?
I understand.
It illustrates a deeply rooted systematic skepticism towards the WHO. It concerns the ultimate core question: who decides over my body? The global elite in Geneva, governing past the sovereign state or myself.
From this perceived existential powerlessness, the compelling urge logically arises to regain control over one's own environment. At this point,
Definitely.
we leave the philosophical level in the source material and arrive at a very harsh, practical implementation. The association offers a detailed guide on crisis preparedness in 8 steps.
A look at these 8 steps is enormously insightful, especially regarding the setting of priorities. One would expect that in a guide for crisis preparedness, the first step would be to stock up on a large supply of water or build up food reserves.
I thought so too. But step 1 literally states firmness in spiritual and personal freedom.
A mental step.
Yes. Only after that, in steps 2 to 8, come tangible things like communication, health protection, personal safety, essential items, financial preparedness, self-sufficiency, and finally, the concrete emergency plan. Why is mental freedom at the top of the checklist for the end of the world?
Because physical preparation without the corresponding mental detachment is considered completely worthless by the association. In this context, mental freedom means mentally saying goodbye to the system perceived as threatening.
You have to be ready in your mind.
Exactly. One must first come to the conviction in their mind that the state will no longer help and society will collapse before building a huge stockpile of canned goods in the home basement makes any logical sense. This cognitive restructuring is the foundation of any further preparation.
And here it gets really interesting when we look at what happens after this mental detachment. The details in the checklists are partly breathtaking. To make this tangible for you, I looked at the list for the so-called home pharmacy. We are not talking about a first aid kit from the supermarket.
Rather not.
The list calls for nail scissors, hot cold packs, hot water bottles, and strong flashlights. It is also advised to maintain a personal medication supply for 6 to 12 months on a rotating basis.
Half a year to a whole year?
Yes, incredible. And then a very specific term stands out on the list, namely Stirnlifaden. Can you put that into context?
Yes, Stirnlifaden is the Swiss term for a very specific surgical suture material.
Surgical suture material for home use?
Exactly. And if you store medical suture material at home, are you no longer preparing for a 3-day power outage?
No, that's a different level.
You almost assume that the medical infrastructure has completely collapsed everywhere and for a very long time. We're talking about preparing for a phase where you can't just drive to the nearest emergency room to have a heavily bleeding laceration stitched up.
But you do it yourself.
You have to do it yourself at the kitchen table. At the same time, the material recommends slowly transitioning to medical alternatives, thus becoming independent from the pharmaceutical industry.
This radical disconnection runs through all areas of life. Another major topic in the sources is finances.
Also a huge control issue.
Yes. There is a reference to a voice message from Club President Christian Oesch from the year 2023. It concerns the urgent anticipation of a global financial crash.
And what is the solution?
The recommended solution is to flee into physical precious metals, especially silver. Paper money and digital accounts are considered worthless or manipulable, which is why hard assets are needed that can be held in hand in an emergency and used as a means of exchange.
This distrust of everything digital and governmental also leads us to a document that deals with communication, the checklist for the so-called ELO behavior.
That was one of the most astonishing documents
ELO
for me.
stands for electronic.
Right. It's about electronic security measures at gatherings, private events, and so-called security-relevant traffic. It reads like something out of a spy movie.
It is a massive indicator of the perceived level of persecution when a civil society group establishes strict behavioral rules for electronic security at completely private meetings.
Lock away cell phones and so on?
Yes. For example, it requires packing smartphones in Faraday cages, removing batteries, or completely avoiding digital scheduling. Then it absolutely assumes that it is being eavesdropped on, monitored, and infiltrated by the state or intelligence agencies.
Intense.
The enormous need for more secure, purely analog communication shows how much the modern digital world is viewed as hostile territory.
We are talking here about Swiss citizens who organize themselves in associations. In the sources, we repeatedly come across the term grassroots. This is mentioned in connection with meetings in Taufen. To me, that initially sounds like a very local, nature-connected network.
The grassroots movement is indeed a large network in Switzerland that grew significantly during the pandemic years.
What is it exactly about?
It's about many alternative lifestyles, building self-sufficient structures, private schooling of children outside the state curriculum, and cooperative agriculture. It has a very local component focused on neighborly help and connection to nature.
And that is exactly what makes our next discovery so incredibly paradoxical. In addition to this grassroots movement, something appears in the sources of the association wire that completely surpasses the dimensions of preparation. The TACDA Academy. That stands for the American Civil Defense Association. This is a U.S. civil defense organization with roots deep in the Cold War. The association WIR refers to their 17 principles for crisis preparedness. How does this American prepper ideology fit with Swiss organic farmers and neighborhood assistance?
This is exactly the fascinating fusion that takes place in this material. On one side, this nature-connected Swiss dropout romanticism. On the other side, a tough, uncompromising American survivalism that anticipates total civilizational collapse.
What are these principles?
The TACDA Academy covers topics such as survival in extremely cold weather. After an EMP, meaning an electromagnetic pulse that destroys all technology, nuclear fallout, chemical and biological warfare, water purification from contaminated sources, and the construction of radiation-proof shelters. It's about pure survival after the event.
To understand the extent of this severity, we need to take a closer look at two specific documents from this academy that appear in the material. The first document deals with the psychology of civil defense. How do these people view the rest of society that is not prepared?
The observation in this psychological document is very pragmatic, but also extremely coldly formulated. The premise is that the broad masses of people live in deceptive comfort, completely ignoring the real possibility of a catastrophe and only panic when the shelves in the supermarket are empty.
And the prepper himself?
The one who studies the TACDA basics sees themselves as the cool, rational observer, intellectually and physically superior to this hysterical, unprepared mass.
It gets even more extreme in document number 16. The topic is triage and first response. That really made me pause.
That's intense.
I actually only know triage from military medicine or absolute disaster scenarios.
Exactly. Triage is the principle of allocating scarce medical resources to maximize the number of survivors.
Who will be treated? Who not?
In practice, however, this also means making the very conscious decision to let certain injured people die because their treatment would tie up too many resources that might save others.
And that for civilians?
That such a harsh medical concept, reduced to mere survival, is conveyed in a civilian preparedness program for private individuals shows the kind of reality these people are mentally preparing for.
If we connect this with the bigger picture, then you are preparing for a scenario where all government aid has disappeared and you have to decide over life and death yourself. A comprehensive guide for a total infrastructure collapse. That is really intense. But what became even clearer to me while going through the sources for the association WIR, the real threat is not just an abstract nuclear war on the other side of the world or a sudden blackout.
No.
The threat in their perception often lurks right outside their own door in the form of their own state.
In this worldview, the state has completely lost its role as a protector and is primarily perceived as a potential aggressor and oppressor.
This is extremely evident in an entire section of the website that explicitly deals with resisting state interventions. A prominent topic is house searches.
There are clear instructions.
The guideline is, stay calm, act correctly. It's interesting that they constantly look beyond the national border. There is an explicit warning about the current developments in Germany.
What exactly is being criticized?
The texts state that in Germany, house searches and device access are already used preventively, often well before a concrete conviction or merely on suspicion of opinion offenses. Although Switzerland still has other legal hurdles, it is warned that technology and data are borderless, and these methods could soon spread.
A central point of modern crisis preparedness is derived from this. It's no longer just about physical barricades at home, but digital self-defense.
So, encryption and such.
The texts correctly analyze that our smartphones, laptops, and clouds today contain our entire lives, our networks, and our world of thoughts.
And they declare the knowledge of how to properly encrypt devices, protect passwords, and change problematic default settings from manufacturers not as excessive paranoia, but as an absolutely necessary basic skill. It is considered pure self-protection.
Yes.
The motto is, a thoughtless word or an open phone during a search can ruin your life. You must acquire the knowledge long before the police are at your door.
And that is not limited to one's own four walls.
Exactly. This defensive stance is not limited to the living room or the smartphone. It extends to an area where we are actually most vulnerable, the hospital. In the sources, we found a current document from the 19th of February 2026.
The patient declaration.
Correct. It's called Self-Determination in the Hospital, a Patient Declaration. Why is a regular advanced healthcare directive no longer sufficient for them?
A classic living will usually regulates things like life-prolonging measures and always assumes that the medical staff in the hospital acts in the best interest of the patient.
Which is actually logical.
For most, yes. This new patient declaration, however, breathes a deep mistrust. It is needed because the medical system is no longer trusted. There is fear of coercive measures, isolation from relatives, or treatments that are massively rejected for ideological reasons.
That is probably still an aftershock of the pandemic.
A legacy of the intense conflicts during the corona pandemic. Exactly. Imagine you are admitted to the hospital after an accident and assume that the doctors there could potentially act against your deepest convictions.
That is an incredibly oppressive idea.
This raises an extremely important question for the general understanding of this group. Imagine going through your normal everyday life and all the familiar supporting structures around you, the police on the street, the doctors in the hospital, the justice system, the entire digital communication technology. All of this is constantly perceived by you as a potential adversary or constant source of danger.
You're basically constantly on alert.
Exactly. This enormous effort of preparation that we analyzed today, from the checklists to the radios to the surgical thread, serves primarily one psychological purpose. It gives the individual in a world they perceive as deeply chaotic, unpredictable, and hostile a desperately needed sense of agency and absolute autonomy. It is a control mechanism against fear.
So what does all this mean in total? We have now worked through a true mountain of views, detailed checklists, and far-reaching survival strategies. When you piece together all these isolated sources from the association WI like a puzzle, it forms the picture of an incredibly detailed blueprint for total autonomy.
Yes, that sums it up well.
This massive engine of preparation is driven by a deep existential concern. The concern about 5G technology, the constant expansion of power by global elites and institutions like the WHO, new health agendas like CP 3.0, and the complete collapse of infrastructure due to blackouts.
And the balancing act you are doing is enormous.
Absolutely. What we are observing here is a tremendous intellectual and physical balancing act. On one side, regional cooperation is being intensely advocated. One should produce locally, live with nature, and cooperate with neighbors in the spirit of the Swiss grassroots idea.
And on the other side?
On the other side, we see an almost military isolation and defensive stance against any state or global interference, supported by American civil defense knowledge, digital self-defense, and triage plans.
This enormous duality of connection to nature and harsh survivalism is indeed the core of it all.
Wow, that is really a strong perspective worth considering. Where exactly does the invisible line lie in everyday life between reasonable precaution and being trapped in one's constant fear of losing control?
That's exactly the question.
An absolutely great conclusion for our detailed examination of this highly complex source material today. I thank you immensely for taking the time to peel back all these layers with us and venture into this deep insight. To you for listening, stay curious, take care of yourself, and we'll hear from each other next time. Take care.